Hello, listeners. Welcome back to TubTube podcast community. Today, we're diving into a deeply emotional and often overlooked chapter of American history. The stories of broken promises, betrayal, and resilience that have shaped the lives of Native American tribes. From the signing of treaties filled with empty promises to the tragic consequences of their violations, this episode will take you on a journey through some of the most heart-wrenching moments in history. So, settle in as we unravel the heartbreaking truths, honor the incredible resilience of Native peoples, and seek to understand the lasting impact of these historic injustices. This is a story that needs to be told, and we're honored to share it with you today. Introduction. Over the course of American history, hundreds of treaties were signed between the United States government and Native American tribes. Promises were made, promises of peace, protection, and mutual respect. Yet, nearly every one of those treaties was broken, leaving a trail of devastation that reshaped the lives of Native peoples forever. For Native Americans, treaties were not just legal documents but agreements forged with hope for peace and coexistence. They represented a bridge between two vastly different cultures, a recognition of tribal sovereignty, and a safeguard for their future. Yet, as the ink dried, these promises became fragile. Land, the sacred heart of their existence, was lost, communities were uprooted, and the very essence of their cultures was threatened. This documentary delves deep into the stories of broken treaties, tracing the roots of betrayal and the ongoing fight for justice. Treaties were essential tools in colonial and early American history, particularly in the United States' westward expansion. To Native tribes, these agreements were sacred. They often viewed treaties as a covenant, grounded in their traditions and spirituality, while assuming the U.S. government would honor its word. Tribes approached treaty negotiations in good faith, often sacrificing significant portions of their land to ensure peace and secure their survival. However, to the U.S. government, treaties were instruments of convenience, used to gain access to resources, land, and control, only to be discarded when they became inconvenient. The introduction of treaties in U.S. policy began during the Revolutionary War, a time when the fledgling United States sought alliances to bolster its military position against Britain. Native tribes like the Lenape, who signed the Treaty of Fort Pitt, were courted as allies. Yet the ink had barely dried before betrayals began. These early treaties set a precedent that would play out again and again. Agreements forged out of necessity for the U.S., only to be disregarded once the nation's goals shifted. One central aspect of this story is the sheer scale of the land lost by Native tribes. Between 1776 and 1887, Native Americans were forced to cede nearly 1.5 billion acres of land through treaties, often signed under duress. The devastating impact of these losses cannot be overstated. For Native peoples, land is more than a physical space. It is a source of spiritual connection, identity, and sustenance. As land was stripped away, so too was the ability to sustain their way of life. Hunting grounds disappeared, sacred sites were desecrated, and entire communities were uprooted, creating a ripple effect of cultural and social disintegration. These losses were compounded by the legal mechanisms that allowed the U.S. government to exploit Native tribes. Treaties were often filled with ambiguous language, deliberately crafted to leave room for interpretation that favored the government. In some cases, tribes were misled about the terms of the treaties they were signing. Negotiations were rarely conducted on an equal footing. Tribes faced immense pressure, threats of violence, and economic coercion. Even when treaties were signed and ratified, the U.S. government often failed to uphold its obligations, whether through neglect, willful ignorance, or outright rejection of the terms. This introduction sets the stage for exploring specific examples of broken treaties, examining how these betrayals unfolded, and the profound consequences they had for Native American tribes. The stories that follow are a testament to the resilience of Native peoples and the enduring fight for justice and sovereignty. 1. The Treaty of Fort Pitt, 1778, first treaty and first betrayal date in place. The Treaty of Fort Pitt, signed in September 1778, was negotiated at Fort Pitt, modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, between the newly formed United States and the Lenape tribe, Delaware. Promises made. The U.S. sought to secure an alliance with the Lenape against the British during the Revolutionary War. The treaty promised protection of Lenape lands, provision of supplies, including weapons and goods. Assistance in creating a future Native American state within the Union. The treaty marked a historic moment as the first official agreement between the United States and a Native American tribe. For the Lenape, it was a gamble for survival, aligning with the U.S. in hopes of securing a future homeland. How it was broken. The U.S. government immediately failed to uphold its promises. Supplies were delayed or never delivered. American military forces began encroaching on Lenape lands, ignoring the treaty's territorial guarantees. Settlers followed, claiming lands in violation of the agreement. The promise of a Native American state was abandoned as soon as the U.S. no longer needed Lenape support. Aftermath and conditions. Disillusioned and betrayed, the Lenape turned away from the U.S. Some allied with the British, while others were forced to migrate westward to escape American expansion. By the early 19th century, the Lenape were pushed out of their ancestral lands entirely, scattering across multiple states and eventually relocating to what is now Oklahoma. 2. The Treaty of New Echota, 1835, the Trail of Tears date and place. Signed on December 29, 1835, in New Echota, Georgia, this treaty involved a faction of the Cherokee Nation and the U.S. government. Promises made. The treaty ceded all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi River in exchange for $5 million, new land in present-day Oklahoma, and assistance for relocation. How it was broken. Despite the treaty being signed by a minority faction of the Cherokee leadership, it was used as a pretext to forcibly remove the entire Cherokee Nation. The U.S. military implemented the removal under harsh and inhumane conditions. Promised resources for the journey were insufficient or non-existent. Aftermath and conditions. The forced march, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 4,000 Cherokee people due to starvation, disease, and exposure. Survivors faced hardship in the unfamiliar lands of Oklahoma, where promised support for rebuilding their communities never materialized. 3. The Fort Laramie Treaty, 1868, betrayal of the Sioux date and place, signed on April 29, 1868. At Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory, this treaty involved the Sioux Nation, Lakota, and the U.S. government. Promises made. The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, including the Black Hills, and guaranteed hunting rights in surrounding areas. It prohibited non-native settlement on Sioux lands without tribal consent. How it was broken. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills in the 1870s, the U.S. government failed to stop miners and settlers from invading Sioux territory. Attempts to renegotiate the treaty were rejected by the Sioux, leading to military conflict. The U.S. ultimately seized the Black Hills, violating the treaty. Aftermath and conditions. The loss of the Black Hills, a sacred site for the Sioux, devastated the tribe spiritually and economically. Legal battles over the land continue to this day, with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1980 that the seizure was illegal and awarding financial compensation. The Sioux have refused the money, demanding the return of their land instead. 4. The Dawes Act, 1887, not a treaty, but a turning point date in policy. Passed by Congress on February 8, 1887, the Dawes Act aimed to assimilate Native Americans by dividing communal lands into individual allotments. Promises made. Native families were promised individual ownership of land, U.S. citizenship, and the remaining lands were to be sold to fund Native schools and services. How it was broken. The act resulted in the loss of over 90 million acres of native land, nearly two-thirds of their remaining territory. Much of the land was sold to non-native settlers, and promised resources for education and welfare were mismanaged or never delivered. Aftermath and conditions. The Dawes Act led to widespread poverty, loss of cultural identity, and further erosion of tribal sovereignty. Many Native families lost their allotments due to fraud or inability to pay taxes. 5. The Nez Perce War, 1877, a fight for survival date and place. The conflict erupted in the summer of 1877, involving the Nez Perce tribe under Chief Joseph. The war spanned across Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. Promises made. The 1855 Treaty of Walla Walla had granted the Nez Perce a reservation that included parts of their ancestral lands. However, an 1863 treaty, signed by a minority of Nez Perce leaders, reduced the reservation by 90%, leading to tensions. How it was broken. The U.S. government insisted the Nez Perce relocate to the smaller reservation despite the 1855 treaty's guarantees. When the Nez Perce refused to comply, the U.S. military was sent to forcibly remove them. The tribe, under Chief Joseph's leadership, fought back fiercely in what would become a lengthy and tragic conflict. Despite their resilience and tactical brilliance, the Nez Perce were eventually outnumbered and surrounded. Aftermath and conditions. After a dramatic and exhausting retreat through several states, Chief Joseph famously surrendered in October 1877, saying, "I will fight no more forever." Though they had fought valiantly, the Nez Perce were forced to relocate to a distant reservation in Oklahoma, far from their homeland. The U.S. government failed to fulfill the promises of peace and security they had once made, and the tribe was left in poverty and despair. The Nez Perce War marked a significant chapter in the larger narrative of Native American resistance to forced relocation and the continual erosion of their rights and lands. That's all for today, and I've a message from my side. Let me know if agree or not in the comments. According to my perspective, the history of the United States is deeply entwined with the legacy of Native American communities. The country's founding and expansion were, in many cases, marked by the displacement, mistreatment, and loss of life of Native peoples. The systemic oppression, broken treaties, and violent actions taken by the U.S. government during the colonization and westward expansion are undeniable. Along with me, many argue that the U.S. stands on the graves of Native Americans due to a long history of betrayal, illegal land seizures, and harmful policies that continue to impact Indigenous communities today. This tragic chapter of history is still reflected in ongoing struggles for justice and recognition. Thanks for listening to this podcast. New episodes are released every Monday through Friday, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss out. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, share, and leave a review. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.